Thank you, Steve. It's always a good way to bring us into what God is hopefully going to be teaching us today. So we're continuing our study of the book of Philippians. It's called Be Encouraged, in particular preaching Christ. And I want you to just kind of think about how it is you go about in your life sharing with others who Jesus is. That's the preaching Christ that he was talking about. We've already read First Philippians, the 12th chapter, first chapter 12 through 20. I'm not going to read that again to you. But you can go ahead and turn it in your Bibles, go through it. I want you to be reading through it because we're going to cover what Paul has to say there. I have a question for you. We brought up Noah earlier in our service. Have you ever considered why the dove that Noah released from the ark actually came back to the ark? You ever thought about that? It's usually part of the story we just sort of gloss over. We don't think about it too much. Whenever I was young, I was pretty captivated by how carrier pigeons worked. I was particularly captivated how they worked as a reliable communications, especially during war times. Back in the day where they were unreliable and they didn't know if they were going to get communication, they could rely on sending messages by strapping a little message on a leg of a bird and sending it off, and it would get to where it was supposed to be. At least that's the way I thought about it. I thought you just sort of, I don't know what you did. I just thought you took this thing and said, I want it to go to whoever, and that bird knew how to do it. I was a kid. I didn't really understand how things work. As I got older, I began to sort of look into how that whole process of communicating works, realized that that's really not how it happens at all. I discovered that you can't actually make a pigeon go where you want it to go. You can't tell it where to go. You can't give it directions on how to go somewhere. You can't take a pigeon and say, man, I got this really important message and I need it to go to Bob, but he's just right there. Could you just take it to him? And you can't make a pigeon do that. You cannot make a pigeon go anywhere you want it to go. However, a pigeon has this really strong desire to go where it was raised. It has this really deep desire to return where it was fed and where it was cared for and where it was loved. It really wants to go home. If you didn't know, the Hebrew word translated dove in the Old Testament when it's talking about Noah, it can also be translated pigeon. They only used one word to describe both kinds of birds. So even in the New Testament, the Greek language works exactly the same way. It only had one word that referred to both doves and pigeons. So it really may have been that the Holy Spirit descended upon Jesus at his baptism like a pigeon. I don't know about you. I kind of like the sound of a dove better. But, it could be either way. Now, if you've ever seen a dove release, maybe in a movie, if you haven't seen one in person, at a wedding or a celebration of some sort, they open up the thing and all these white birds fly out, and we all think of them as being like a dove release because we like that image. They're actually pigeons that have been bred to be white and kind of look like a dove. Because doves don't really have a real strong homing instinct to them, but pigeons do. Pigeons want to go home, and so when they release them with those things, all those white dove-looking things end up going home. So, they're safe. They're not just going out to anywhere. They have this strong, reliable homing instinct. Now, whatever you want to call this bird that Noah released, it had this amazing ability to find its way home. If you want to send a message to someone with a bird like that, you would carry it with you away from its home to wherever it is you were. Then you would write your message and you would attach it to the bird somehow, usually on one of the legs. Then you would throw it up in the air and it would sort of spin around until it located itself and figured out where home was at, and then it would fly home. And it would get there. Now, whoever takes care of the pigeons at its home would look for the new arrivals. They would find those that have messages on it, and they would read them, and they would get it to whoever they were intended for. There are actually records indicating that this form of communication was even used by the Egyptians. That was some 5,000 years ago. They say that you can take a pigeon up to 1,000 miles away and it will still figure out how to get home. We don't know how long Noah had this dove before he released it. But we do know that it was with him on the ark for quite a while. If you did the math of the story in Genesis, he had it at least 271 days before he released it the first time. We know that once it was released, it tried to return to its home, but there was nothing left of it, so it came back to the only safe place it knew. It came back to the ark. Noah waited another 7 days and he sent it back out again. It still couldn't find its home, but this time it returned with an olive leaf, and Noah knew that at least the waters were beginning to recede. He released that pigeon again another 7 days later, and that time it found its home, and it did not return to the ark. And Noah knew that this meant that it wouldn't be too long until he would be able to leave the ark as well. Which means that the ark never became the home for that pigeon. Less than desirable circumstances in our life, even though we've been at church for a long time, even though we've been showing up and we've been going to it and we're trying to make it home, if it doesn't become our home, whenever bad things happen, we will no longer feel safe. We will no longer feel protected. We will no longer feel cared for. And because of those bad things happening, being with God and being in the church just won't feel like home to us. We will want to know why God let something bad happen to us if this was really our situation might be the result of an accident or a disease or the result of some opposition or attack from some enemy. It could be even the result of our own poor choices. But regardless of the reason, we feel that God really should have protected us from suffering any negative consequences. We feel let down by God, and we wonder if He really cares. Some even wonder if He actually exists. I mean, after all, how or why would a good, all-powerful God let anything bad happen to His children? We respond this way to our circumstances because Satan is very good about whispering lies into our ears about ourselves and our world and our God. It's exactly what he did to Adam and Eve. He tells us that God doesn't really care about us. He tells us that God is actually preventing us from experiencing the very best that life has to offer. He tells us that we really deserve better than what God is giving to us, and we can have that better if we just follow His advice and we return to our old home. Remember how Satan told Adam and Eve, oh, what's that? God said that you're going to die if you eat from that tree? Nonsense. He's just trying to scare you. He doesn't want you to gain the knowledge of good and evil, because if you do, then you'd be just like him. And he doesn't want you to be just like him. Satan tells us that he will help us get what we deserve, that we'll get what we need. In fact, God has given us the ability and the opportunity to choose for ourselves whether we will or will not obey what He gives to us, even though He wants us to choose what's right. He even allows us to be tempted. He lets Satan go around trying to deceive us. But He does promise us that He would not allow us to be tempted beyond our ability to withstand it. And He also gives us the promise that with every temptation, He'll provide a way of escape. Of course, Paul was giving that bit of wisdom to believers. Believers whose inner instinct had been reoriented toward God rather than toward the world. Adam and Eve were the very first to choose for themselves. We know that story. And as a result of their choosing poorly, bad things started to happen in God's good world. Their sin brought about disease, and sorrow, heartache, murder, shame, death. all those bad things that we get upset about when they happen. And these things from time to time actually happen to good people. They simply can't be avoided by anyone. Bad things are going to happen. But we are given the promise, we're given the hope, that one day that will come to an end. And that none of these things will take place anymore whenever God's kingdom fully comes. And we get to be with Him in that heavenly home where there's no more tears, no more sorrows, because sin no longer has its impact there. We long for that. We want to go to that home. We've been changed, and our instinct is telling us that that's where we want to go. We do everything we can to move that direction. The Apostle Paul was no exception when it came to experiencing bad things in this life that could get you distracted. In fact, he said that he had experienced more bad things than any of the other apostles. This is what he shared with the ancient believers in Corinth about his own experiencing bad in this world. He says, are they servants of Christ? Now, I'm speaking as if I'm insane. I more so. Because I've been more so in far many more labors and far many more imprisonments. I've been beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys. And on those journeys I was in danger from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my own countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers in the sea, dangers from false brethren. I've been in labor and hardships. I've been through so many sleepless nights. I've been hungry and thirsty and without food. I've been cold and exposed. And apart from all those external things, there's the daily pressure on me for the concern for all of the churches. He experienced bad things. Following Jesus really does lead to the best, better life. Even if we have to endure some of those bad things that happen because we live in this fallen world or because we're trying to advance the cause of Christ. When you start preaching Christ, you're going to meet some opposition. You're going to experience some bad things. It was during those times that Paul learned to trust God to lead him and use him in the midst of those less than desirable circumstances. He learned about doing so, and he shared his wisdom, as we heard earlier, to the believers in Rome when he told them, we know that God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love him and who are called according to his purposes. Those are encouraging words. Paul's not so wonderful experience of being imprisoned in Rome had resulted in what he said in our text, for the greater progress of the gospel. His situation, being imprisoned, which wasn't a good thing, for preaching the gospel, had become well known through the Praetorian Guard. And he said to everyone else, that wouldn't have happened had he not been in prison. And the way Paul spoke of it in this letter gives the distinct impression that perhaps some of those guards who were hearing about it were even coming to faith as a result of Paul's defense of the gospel. They were hearing him defend his faith, and they were coming to believe. Much like the guard who accompanied him to Rome, it seems like he came to believe. Or like the Cornelius, you remember his story. He was a Roman centurion of the imperial guard who came to believe whenever Peter preached to him, as did the Philippian jailer and his whole household, who were founding members of the church to whom Paul wrote this particular letter. Good things were happening. Another good thing that Paul pointed out was about the brethren. Now, this was a specific term for him. He was using this to refer to the young men that he was training to preach the gospel, people who were following him, people who he was sending out, people like Timothy and Titus. They were encouraged by what was happening to Paul in Rome in his imprisonment. In fact, what was going on there actually inspired them, Paul said, to preach the word of God without fear. You see, they were able to preach without fear of being arrested themselves because it looked like Paul was going to win his case. And then he would be released, which meant that no one else would be arrested for preaching the gospel as Paul had been arrested for it. Paul's imprisonment and his defense was like someone would be going before the Supreme Court today and winning their case. If Paul won, it would mean that everyone else who preached Christ wouldn't have to fear that anymore. And so these young guys were more and more encouraged to stand out and preach the gospel without fear of being arrested. That's a good thing. And it wouldn't have happened if Paul hadn't experienced that bad thing of being imprisoned. And since Paul was unavailable to move around and preach to these churches or plant new ones, it left openings for others to do so, to step up and to do that work of Christ in preaching the gospel. And that was another good thing too. He was excited that other people were getting involved in this advancing of the gospel in their world. Now, Paul did note that not all of those preachers who were rising up did it out of the best of motives. Some, he said, were more interested in building up their own following. They were more interested in people following them so they could have those bragging rights of, hey, look at these people, they're following me. They were even certain that whenever Paul heard that his own followers or previous followers were now following these new preachers that were rising up, that it would discourage Paul. Because, well, that's the way they would have felt if they had heard that their disciples were going after someone else. But nothing could be further from the truth. Paul rejoiced because the cause of Christ was being lifted up, even if those who were doing it were self-serving. Paul earnestly believed that the spread of the gospel, despite who did it, would result in his own deliverance from prison. And that would be a good thing too. He believed that it sort of worked this way. When you work through the original, what Paul was talking about, this was sort of his thinking about it. Well, they preach Christ is going to make more believers. If there are more believers, that means there are going to be more people praying. And one of the things they're going to be praying about is for my deliverance. And that's a great thing. So that's going to work toward my deliverance. And if there are more believers, it also means that there's going to be more provisions for my needs and the needs of others as the Spirit guides them to help, which it will. He saw this as a win-win situation. It's a lot of good things resulting from Paul's experiencing the bad of imprisonment. He didn't even include the fact that it forced him to write letters, and those letters became the bulk of the content of the New Testament. That's another good thing that resulted from it. God really can and does bring about good things from those less than desirable circumstances in our lives. That doesn't mean that those bad things are good. It just means that God can use them for good. Bad things are bad. But Satan would use those bad things to discourage us, to destroy us, to make us give up hope. He would lie about them, and he would lead us into circumstances that would overwhelm us. But God leads us through them, and he sustains us in the midst of them, and he brings about these good things whenever we show ourselves faithful to him, and we're able to be faithful in our preaching of Christ in the midst of our circumstances. I mean, it's encouraging when you go to someone and they're going through a time in their life and you look at it and you just say, I am so glad I'm not in their shoes. I remember a guy when I was serving in Artesia who was dying. And he's the guy who used to go around and we'd go calling on people, and John always went with me, and he was dying. It was a bad thing. And I went to visit him, and I was feeling kind of sad for him. And he goes, Doug, you're not going to believe this. I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, these visiting nurses that are coming in, I get to preach Christ to them. I'm going like, only you, John, would see this good thing in the midst of this circumstance. But that's how Paul was looking at his bad thing. And that's how we all need to look at those bad circumstances in our lives. How can we use this to preach Christ? Paul said at the end of this section in verse 20, I will not be put to shame about anything that's happening to me. The Greek word translated shame there literally meant to be disfigured. It referred to how a disfigured person is made to feel about themselves. Sometimes we make people who are disfigured feel that they're ugly, that they're broken, that they're useless, that they're unwanted. But Paul's imprisonment didn't make him feel that way at all. Hearing that his followers were following someone else didn't make him feel that way at all. In fact, it energized him and it made him hopeful and expectant and bold. He was convinced that whatever happened to him, whether it resulted in his freedom or even his death, that Christ would be exalted by it, that he would be lifted up. It would just be one more, or perhaps the last opportunity he had to lift up Christ, and he was going to take that opportunity. See, Paul spent a lot of his ministry in prison, but prison never became his home. It would never prevent him from getting to the home that he longed for. There's not a bad circumstance that can prevent a believer from heading home, not even death. As Paul headed toward his heavenly home, he took every opportunity to lift up Christ with every breath he had. The message he carried was not to be delivered at the end point like those pigeons, but his message was delivered to every person he encountered along the way. And that's where all of us preach Christ. Not because you get to stand up here on Sunday morning, but it's all those people that you encounter every day that you're preaching Christ to. I think that Paul's thought process was heavily influenced by that time when Jesus said, when I am lifted up, everyone will be drawn to me. And that's what Paul desired. Paul did not want people to be drawn to Paul. He didn't want people saying, oh, Paul, you're so wonderful, you're so good. He wanted people being drawn to Christ. And we should have that same desire. I love the pulpit that used to be at Dallas Christian College. It had engraved in the wood on the top this message. I didn't know it was there until I preached my senior sermon. And it says, Sir, we would see Jesus. I think that Paul shared the same sort of sentiment that John the Baptist expressed when he was in prison. You remember when John was in prison? One that resulted in his head being cut off. No one would call that a good thing. But during that time, John's disciples kept coming back and reporting to him, hey, your followers are leaving you, John. They're starting to follow Jesus. What are we going to do about this? He said, well, tell me what's going on. Well, the blind are seeing, the poor are being fed, the prisoners are being set free. Yeah, Jesus really is the Christ. You know, he has to increase, and I have to decrease. Some believers want, some believers need, at least that's what they say, to be the center of attention whenever they preach Christ. They are the sort of person who might end up saying, oh, just think of what a mess that church would be without me. I mean, it would just fall apart if I wasn't there. Even so, they still proclaim Christ. And so proclaiming Christ is still a good thing. But how much better it is when believers keep the focus on Christ and him alone. Paul's example of being that sort of believer is encouraging. And I hope that we all follow his example as we make our own return to our heavenly home, as that inner instinct in us leads us toward heaven. I hope that we point people to Christ, saying, you know, he really is the only way to heaven. You need to get to know Jesus. He's the one who said, no one comes to the Father except through me. That me was Jesus. If heavenly home is not where your homing instinct is leading you, then it's time to let Jesus bring you into God's family. It is time for you to let him change you and transform you so that inner desire is no longer for the world, but that inner desire is for Jesus and his heavenly home, so that you can be on that same sort of path that the rest of us who've been transformed are on. It really is the best way to live life, because it's the way to live life forever. We're going to have a hymn of invitation. If you're living that life, be encouraged. And if you're not, let Jesus transform you into one of his children so that you can have that same desire for his heavenly home.